The maintenance log for buoy station 7 Foxtrot shows we completed the scheduled service at 14:22 on a Thursday in late October. It does not show what happened between 14:22 and when we radioed the harbor at 19:47. 5 hours and 25 minutes. The log shows nothing during that window because I did not enter anything during that window. I was the one responsible for the log. I made a professional decision not to document what I could not document accurately, and I have regretted that decision every day since, not because I think documentation would have changed anything, but because the absence of a record is its own kind of statement, and the statement it makes is that nothing occurred, and something occurred. I am writing this now because Marcus's wife called me last month. Not to ask questions. She said she just wanted to hear someone say his name who had been there. I said his name. She thanked me and hung up. I sat with the phone in my hand for a long time after that, and somewhere in the sitting I understood that what I owe, to her, to the rest of the crew, to myself, is an account that is as accurate as I can make it. Not a report. Not a filing. Just an account. I should explain how this started. The National Data Buoy Center maintains a network of oceanographic and meteorological monitoring stations distributed across coastal and offshore waters along all 3 U.S. seaboards and across the Great Lakes. Most people understand these as the orange or yellow buoys they see on NOAA weather feeds, the ones that report wave height, water temperature, air pressure, wind speed. They are the infrastructure behind every offshore forecast, every storm track model, every Coast Guard decision about when to close a shipping lane. They are unglamorous, utilitarian, and almost entirely invisible to the general public, which is approximately correct. They are the kind of thing you only think about when they stop working. Keeping them working is our job. I have been with the maintenance crew out of Morehead City, North Carolina for 11 years. Before that I spent 4 years on a similar crew operating out of Woods Hole, Massachusetts, which is where I learned the trade. The work is physically demanding in the way that all marine field work is physically demanding. You are on a vessel in open water in conditions that range from pleasant to actively hostile, you are handling heavy equipment on a moving deck, you are diving in water that is sometimes warm and sometimes not, and the margin for error in most of what you do is narrow enough that you develop a particular relationship with the word careful that people who work on land generally do not have. You do not become cavalier about the water. The ones who become cavalier eventually stop working on the water, one way or another. Our crew in Morehead City runs 3 to 5 people depending on the deployment. Routine servicing, battery replacement, sensor calibration, biofouling removal, mooring chain inspection, those operations typically go out with 3. Anything involving a full anchor recovery or major structural work goes out with 5. The vessel we operate from is a 42-foot aluminum hull workboat called the Harlan K, which is not glamorous but is reliable in a way that matters more than glamour. She has twin 300 horsepower diesel inboards, a hydraulic crane rated to 4,000 pounds, a dive platform welded to the stern, and enough deck space to work comfortably when conditions are reasonable. When conditions are not reasonable, we work anyway, just with more care. The crew that went out on the October Thursday I am describing was myself, Marcus Webb, Danny Ostrowski, and Pete Callahan. 4 people. Marcus was the crew lead. He had seniority on the Morehead City operation and had been running that particular route for 6 years. I was second. Danny and Pete were both capable in the water and reliable on deck. We had worked together long enough that the 4 of us had developed the kind of operational fluency you only get through repetition. We communicated in shorthand, we anticipated each other's movements, we rarely had to explain what we needed. This is the kind of crew cohesion that makes difficult work feel manageable. I want to be clear about that before anything else. The crew was competent. What happened was not the result of error, inexperience, or negligence. The October deployment was a standard multi-buoy service run. We had 5 stations scheduled: 7 Delta, 7 Echo, 7 Foxtrot, 7 Golf, and 7 Hotel, all positioned along a roughly diagonal offshore corridor running from about 34 miles out to approximately 67 miles southeast of the inlet. The stations are spaced between 8 and 14 nautical miles apart depending on their position in the corridor. A 5-station run in good conditions takes a full day, typically 7 to 8 hours of field time plus transit. We had left the dock at 0615 and made good time through the first 3 stations. The weather was holding better than forecast. Seas at 3 to 4 feet, wind from the southwest at 12 knots, visibility clear to the horizon. It was a good day to be offshore, which in my experience means you bank it because the next one might not be. 7 Foxtrot was the 4th station. We reached it at approximately 1340. The buoy itself is a 3-meter discus type. The round hull is roughly 10 feet in diameter with a central tower assembly carrying the meteorological sensors, solar panels, and a VHF/UHF antenna stack. Beneath the hull, a watch circle of mooring chain and road extends down to a concrete anchor block sitting in about 180 feet of water. The hull rides on the surface and moves with wave action. From a distance it looks like a large orange frisbee standing on edge. Up close it smells like marine growth and machine oil and salt. When we came alongside 7 Foxtrot, Marcus ran through the standard approach checklist while Pete handled the lines. I noted the time, 13:42, in the maintenance log. The buoy's telemetry was transmitting normally according to the shore station data we had pulled that morning. Sensors were reading within nominal range. Battery voltage was flagged at 82%, which was the reason for the scheduled service. The threshold for preventive replacement is 85%, meaning we were slightly overdue, which sometimes happens when weather delays push the rotation. Nothing about the station's condition was unusual. What was unusual, the first thing, the small thing, was the hull temperature. This is not dramatic. I want to be clear about that. Hull temperature on a moored buoy is a function of sun exposure, ambient air temperature, and how long the hull has been sitting in one position. In late October, with water temperature in the low 60s and air temperature in the mid-50s, you expect the hull of a steel or polyethylene buoy to feel cool to the touch. When Pete grabbed the mooring cleat to tie us alongside, he made a comment. He said it felt warm. I was logging. I said something noncommittal. Marcus was on the bow assessing the sensor tower. Danny was pulling the battery replacement kit from the forward locker. Nobody gave it more than a passing note. Pete did not let it go entirely. He ran his palm along the hull below the waterline, the part that had been submerged, and said that it was warm there too. Not just the sun-facing portion. The underside. Marcus came aft and felt it himself. He agreed it was warmer than expected. He noted it verbally and told me to log an observation. I did. I wrote hull temp anomalous, elevated on all surfaces including subside. No mechanical explanation identified. Proceeding with scheduled service. That observation is in the log. You can read it. It is the only observation from that day that is in the log, because everything after 14:22 I did not record, and I have already said why. We proceeded with the service. Battery replacement on a discus buoy takes about 40 minutes if everything goes smoothly. You open the hull access panel on the leeward side, disconnect the battery bank, pull the old units using the crane, drop the new ones in, reconnect, run a voltage check, close the panel, and log completion. While Marcus and I handled the battery swap, Pete went into the water to run a visual inspection of the upper mooring chain and check the hull for unusual fouling. Danny stayed on deck to manage lines and hand tools. The service proceeded without incident. Pete came up from the water at 14:09. He reported the chain was in good condition, no corrosion beyond normal parameters, the anchor rod appeared intact. He mentioned the water temperature around the buoy was noticeably warmer than it had been at the previous stations, not dramatically so, but measurably. He said it felt like swimming near a heat vent. We noted it. There is no mechanical component of a NDBC buoy that generates heat into the surrounding water column. The battery bank does not produce significant thermal output. The sensors are passive. There is no active discharge system. There is no explanation for localized warming of the water column at a passive monitoring station. I logged completion of service at 14:22. Marcus initialed. We should have moved on. We did not move on immediately because the crane jib had developed a slight bind in the rotation housing during the battery pull, and Marcus wanted to look at it before we transited to 7 Golf. So we sat alongside 7 Foxtrot for a few minutes while Marcus worked the crane through its rotation cycle and Pete handed him tools. I was at the helm console in the wheelhouse running through the pre-transit checklist. Danny was at the stern drinking coffee. That is when Danny heard it. She came forward to the wheelhouse door and asked if the radio was on. I said yes, we were monitoring 16 and 22A as standard. She said she heard someone say her name. I asked if she thought it came from the radio. She said she wasn't sure. She said it had sounded close. Like someone near the boat. I stepped out onto the deck and looked around. The water was empty in all directions to the visible horizon. 7 Foxtrot rowed quietly to our port side. There was no other vessel within visual range. The only sound was the diesel idling low, the water against the hull, the distant creak of the buoy's mooring chain. I asked Danny to describe what she heard. She said it was just her name. Her first name. Spoken clearly. Like someone trying to get her attention without raising their voice. Marcus looked up from the crane housing. He had been listening. He said, without particular emphasis, "Don't answer it." Danny said, "Don't answer what?" Marcus said, "Whatever you heard. Don't respond to it." His tone was not alarmed. It was the same tone he used for any operational instruction, level, specific, non-negotiable. Danny and I both understood that tone. We had worked with him long enough to know the difference between when Marcus was offering an opinion and when he was issuing a directive. This was a directive. I asked him what he meant. He said, "It's in the operational guidance. If you hear a voice at sea that you can't source, you don't acknowledge it. That's all." I had been working offshore for 15 years at that point. I had read the NDBC operational safety guidance when I started and reviewed it periodically. I did not recall a prohibition against acknowledging voices. I did not say this out loud. I filed it, the way you file things when you are on deck with work in front of you and there is time to address questions later. Marcus finished with the crane. He declared it operational. We prepared to get underway. That is when Pete said he heard it too. He was still on the aft deck, coiling the last of the lines. He stopped and looked toward the water on the starboard side, the side away from the buoy, and stood there for a moment without moving. Then he said, quietly, "There's someone in the water." We all looked. There was nothing in the water. No person, no debris, no marine animal of sufficient size to be confused for a person. The surface was clear to the horizon on the starboard side. Pete said, "It said my name." It knew my full name. His full name was Peter Aloysius Callahan. He had a standing policy against anyone using his middle name, which everyone on the crew respected because the name was, by his own admission, genuinely unfortunate. He was not someone who went by Aloysius in any context, and his middle name was not something that came up in the course of maritime operations. It was on his personnel file and his emergency contact form and nowhere else. Marcus said, again, in the same tone, "Do not answer it." Pete said, "I wasn't going to." But his voice had changed. There was something in it I had not heard before, a hesitation that was not quite fear and not quite confusion but something between them. Something that comes when a thing you had categorized as external suddenly feels personal. We got underway at 14:31, 9 minutes past the logged service completion time. I did not log the 9 minutes. I did not log Danny hearing her name. I did not log Pete's account of hearing his full name, including the middle name, called from the water on the unoccupied side of the boat. In retrospect, I should have. I know that. I am saying so here because accuracy requires I admit the error. At the time, my reasoning was that the log was a maintenance record, not an incident log, and that what I had witnessed did not constitute a documentable incident in any category I had a form for. That reasoning was not dishonest. It was also not sufficient. We made 7 golf in just under an hour. The service was routine. Nobody heard anything. The water temperature at the station was normal for the season. We completed the work in 38 minutes and moved on. 7 Hotel was the last station of the day. We reached it at 16:55 with about 2.5 hours of usable daylight remaining. The service should have taken no more than 40 minutes, which would have put us underway by 17:35 and back at the dock by 2000 hours, which is a long day but a manageable one. The weather was still holding. The wind had backed slightly and picked up to about 15 knots, which was putting a chop on the surface but nothing that affected operations. Everything about the approach to 7 Hotel was normal. I need to describe 7 Hotel's position before I describe what happened there, because the position matters. 7 Hotel is the outermost station on the corridor. It sits at 67 miles southeast of the inlet, in water that is approximately 340 feet deep. At that distance offshore, on a clear day, you cannot see land. You cannot see any reference to land. The horizon is water in all directions and the sky above it, and the buoy sits in the middle of that geometry like a small orange period at the end of a very long sentence. It is not an uncomfortable feeling if you are accustomed to offshore work, but it is a particular feeling, a feeling of being genuinely out, genuinely away from the infrastructure of the shore. The nearest vessel to us when we arrived at 7 Hotel, according to the AIS display, was a container ship 22 miles to our northeast making for the shipping lanes. We were, for practical purposes, alone. The service at 7 Hotel began normally. Marcus assessed the tower. Pete went over the side for the chain inspection. I opened the hull access panel and found the battery bank at 79%, lower than the 7 Foxtrot reading and technically past the preventive replacement threshold. I noted the time, 17:03. Danny prepped the replacement units. At 17:21, I was inside the hull access cavity running the reconnection on the new battery bank when I heard it myself. I want to be precise about this because precision matters and because I have thought about what I heard more times than I can count, and I have never found a reason to believe I misheard it or misattributed it. It was my name. My first name. Spoken from the water on the starboard side of the boat, the side away from the buoy, away from Pete, in open water. The voice was clear and close, within what I would estimate as 15 feet. It was not a male voice and it was not a female voice, or rather it was not specifically either. It had a quality that I can only describe as approximate, like a close reproduction of human vocalization that has not quite finished resolving into a specific human register. And it knew my name. My first name only, but the correct one, not a nickname, not a shortened form, the name as it appears on my personnel documentation. I did not answer it. I finished the reconnection. I ran the voltage check. I logged service completion at 17:38. I did not log what I had heard. When I came out of the hull cavity, Danny was looking at me with an expression that told me she already knew. I said quietly, "Did you hear anything?" She shook her head. I said, "On the starboard side." She shook her head again. She said, "I've been on the starboard side for the last 20 minutes. There's nothing there." Marcus was closing the tower access panel on the upper section of the buoy. He had not come down to the deck. I called up to him and asked when we were getting underway. He said 5 minutes. His voice was normal. His movements were normal. He finished what he was doing and descended the maintenance ladder to the hull and then stepped aboard the Harlan K with the same economical motion he used 100 times a year. I asked him about the operational guidance. About the prohibition. He sat down on the equipment bench and looked at the deck for a moment. Then he said, "It's not in the written guidance." I said, "Then where does it come from?" He said it was a standing verbal directive. Something that got passed down between crew leads. He had heard it from the person he'd replaced when he took the Moorhead City route, who had heard it from the person before him. He didn't know how far back it went. He said the instruction he had been given was straightforward: if you hear a voice at sea that knows your name, do not respond. Do not acknowledge it verbally or by gesture or by moving toward it. Go about your work. Get underway as soon as the work permits. I asked what happened if you answered it. He said he didn't know. He said the instruction he received did not include a description of consequences, only the directive itself. I asked if he had heard his own name called. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said yes. At 7 Foxtrot, while he was working the crane. From somewhere below the waterline on the port side. I said, "And you didn't tell us?" He said, "I told you not to answer." There was a silence. The Harlan K rose and fell on the chop. Somewhere beneath us, 340 feet of dark water between the hull and the bottom. I said, "Where's Pete?" Pete had gone over the side at 17:05 for the mooring chain inspection. He had not come back up. I want to be clear about the timeline because I went over it until I nearly lost my mind with it afterward, and the timeline is the part that makes no procedural sense. A chain inspection at 7 Hotel should take 12 to 15 minutes. Pete was experienced in the water. He had proper exposure protection for the water temperature. He had a safety line, a 10-meter tether clipped to the dive platform fitting into his harness, standard procedure for all water entries. The safety line's tether point on the dive platform was still occupied. The clip was still attached to the platform fitting. The other end of the tether, the end that should have been attached to Pete's harness, was in the water, trailing alongside the platform, unclipped. The clip mechanism on our tether hardware requires a deliberate two-stage operation to release, a thumb press and a collar rotation. It does not release under load. It does not release by accident. It does not release when a diver is in the water without a decision being made to release it. We searched for 45 minutes. Marcus drove a slow expanding circle pattern around the buoy while Danny and I watched the water from the bow and stern. We called his name. We used the spotlight even though we still had daylight, because the chop was putting shadows on the surface and the spotlight cuts through that. We saw nothing. At 1837 I radioed the Coast Guard sector on Channel 16 and reported a man overboard at the 7 Hotel position. I gave the coordinates, the vessel description, the victim's name, age, physical description, and the time of water entry. The watch officer at sector acknowledged immediately and dispatched a 47-foot motor lifeboat and requested air support from Air Station Elizabeth City. I kept the channel open. The Coast Guard assets were on scene by 2015. The search continued until 2340, when the on-scene coordinator suspended operations due to darkness, sea state, and elapsed time. It was resumed at first light the following morning and continued for 3 days. Peter Aloysius Callahan was not found. I am going to tell you what I know, which is not very much, and I am going to be careful not to supplement it with what I suspect, because the account I owe is an account of what I can verify and not an account of what I believe. What I can verify is the following. Pete entered the water at 7 Hotel at approximately 17:05. He was attached to the Harlan Quay by a safety tether. At some point before 1738, the logged service completion time, the tether was released from his end by a deliberate mechanical action. He was not recovered. He was not found in 3 days of combined air and surface search covering a substantial area accounting for drift and current. What I can verify about the voices is the following. Danny heard her name called at 7 Foxtrot. Pete heard his full name, including the middle name that was on his personnel file and nowhere in general circulation, called at 7 Foxtrot from the unoccupied side of the vessel. Marcus heard his name at 7 Foxtrot while working the crane. I heard my name at 7 Hotel while inside the hull cavity. All 4 incidents involved voices sourced from the water at close range on the unoccupied side of whatever work was in progress. All 4 incidents involved correct identification by first name or full name. None of the 4 of us responded verbally or by movement. Pete went into the water at 7 Hotel 17 minutes after we arrived there. The chain inspection is a solo task and takes him away from direct line of sight of the deck for portions of its duration. I did not see Pete after he entered the water. Marcus did not see Pete after he entered the water. Danny did not see Pete after he entered the water. The 5-hour and 25-minute window between logged service completion and the harbor radio call was almost entirely consumed by the search. We were not idle. We were not paralyzed. We were looking for Pete with everything we had. I want that stated clearly. What I cannot verify, what I will not put into the account as fact because I did not witness it, is what happened to Pete between water entry and the discovery of the unclipped tether. I do not know whether he heard something while he was in the water. I do not know whether he answered it. I do not know whether answering it, if he did, had any causal relationship to his disappearance. I am telling you I do not know these things because they are true, and because an account that fills the gaps with inference is not the account I'm trying to write. What I will say, as a factual observation about the operational structure we were working within, not as a conclusion about cause, is that Pete was the only one of us who could not have heard Marcus's directive when it was given. Marcus said do not answer it twice, once when Danny heard her name at 7 Foxtrot, and once after Pete reported hearing his own name. Both times, Pete was present. Pete was on deck. Pete heard the directive. But Pete heard his name called from the water at 7 Foxtrot, and then Pete was in the water at 7 Hotel. And I do not know what you can hear from inside the water, in 340 feet of ocean, 67 miles from shore, when something in the water knows your name and is close enough to reach the surface of your hearing. I don't know if the prohibition works the same way underwater. That thought has stayed with me. I am including it because accuracy requires I include what has stayed with me, even when I cannot verify it. There was a formal investigation. Coast Guard Casualty Investigation, NDBC Internal Safety Review, an OSHA Maritime Fatality Inquiry. I gave accounts to all three. I gave accurate accounts of the service timeline, the tether condition, the search, the radio calls. I gave accurate accounts of the hull temperature anomaly at 7 Foxtrot and the water temperature observation Pete had made. I logged those items in writing as part of the casualty reports. I did not include the voices in any formal account. I am aware this was wrong. I said so to Marcus the day after we got back, and he looked at me for a long time and then said he hadn't included them either. He said he didn't think it would help. I said I wasn't sure that was the right standard. He said, "What standard would you use?" I didn't have an answer. I still don't. What I understood, in the weeks after the investigation concluded and the file was closed as an unexplained overboard fatality, is that Marcus's decision not to document the voices was not a decision made out of self-protection or to avoid scrutiny. I believe, and this is my reading of the men, not a verified fact, that it was a decision made because the voices did not have a category in any form the investigation had available, and because putting something into a formal record without a category for it does not preserve the information. It orphans it. It becomes a notation in a file that nobody has the framework to read, and in the meantime it transforms the rest of what you say into testimony from someone who reported hearing voices. That is not an excuse. I want to be clear about that. I am explaining the reasoning because accurate accounting requires explaining the reasoning. The decision was wrong and I knew it was wrong, and the wrongness of it has not diminished with time. The NDBC Safety Review recommended updated tether inspection protocols and a revised buddy system requirement for all solo water entries. Those recommendations were implemented within 6 months. They were sensible recommendations. They would have been sensible recommendations regardless of what happened to Pete. They address the gap in the procedure that is visible from the outside, the fact that a diver can be in the water without another crew member maintaining visual contact. They do not address anything else. After the investigation closed, I went looking for the operational guidance Marcus had mentioned. The verbal directive. I went looking not because I thought I would find it written down, he had already told me it wasn't in the written guidance, but because I wanted to understand the chain of transmission. I wanted to know how far back it went and who had originated it and what they had known. What I found was partial and unsatisfying, and I am going to share it in the order I found it because the order matters for understanding what I think it represents. The first thing I found was a footnote in a 1987 internal safety review conducted by NOAA's Environmental Buoy program, which was the organizational predecessor of the current NDBC operations structure. The review was primarily about tether hardware standards following a fatality the previous year, a crew member lost from a maintenance vessel in the Gulf of Mexico, and most of it was technical. The footnote was in a section on crew behavior protocols. It was brief. It said, in full, personnel should be advised per local operational custom regarding acoustic phenomena reported at certain stations, particularly in warm water anomalous zones. Station commanders may transmit applicable guidance verbally according to regional precedent. That was all it said. The footnote had no reference number. It cited nothing. The section it appeared in had no other mention of acoustic phenomena. The fatality it was written to address, the 1986 Gulf of Mexico incident, I traced to a casualty report in the USCG Historical Archive. The report described the loss of a crew member from a NOAA buoy tender in the Gulf. The official cause was listed as unexplained overboard, circumstances unwitnessed. The report noted the water entry was for a routine mooring chain inspection. The report noted the safety tether was found unclipped on the vessel end. The report did not note anything about voices or acoustic phenomena. In the section for additional contributing factors, the reporting officer had written, "Crew member may have entered water at anomalous thermal zone. See referenced environmental data." The referenced environmental data was not attached to the digitized version of the report. I requested the original file through the archive system. The response I received said the file was complete as digitized. I found 2 other incidents through a different path, through the maintenance logs of retired crew leads whose paper records had been partially scanned into the legacy NDBC document system before the transition to digital operations. The scanning was incomplete and the indexing was inconsistent, but I had time and I had a specific search pattern, and eventually I found what I was looking for. The first was a log from a crew operating out of Gloucester, Massachusetts in 1994. The log was a routine maintenance record for a station I did not recognize by number. The numbering system had changed, but the position coordinates placed it offshore in the Gulf of Maine at approximately 58 nautical miles from shore. The log entry for a specific service date had the standard completion notations and then, in a different ink as if added later, the following: 2 crew members reported name calls from water during service, starboard side, no visual source. Both complied with standing instruction. No further incident. The crew lead had signed his initials below it. I looked up his name. He had retired in 2002 after 23 years with the program. I found a phone number through a maritime industry directory that was several years out of date. He was still at the same number. I called him on a Tuesday afternoon in November. I told him who I was and what I was calling about. There was a pause on his end. Then he said, "Someone was lost." It was not a question. I said yes. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he was sorry. He said it in a way that did not sound like a formality. I asked him about the log entry. About the standing instruction. I asked him where it came from. He said he had received it the same way Marcus had, verbally, from the person he'd replaced. He said he had received it as a simple operational directive without explanation, and he had followed it and passed it on without explanation because that was how it had come to him and he did not have an explanation to add. I asked if he had ever experienced it himself. He said yes. Twice. Both times at the same station. Both times from the water on the unoccupied side of the vessel. Both times correct identification by first name. I asked what it sounded like. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Like someone who learned what a voice should sound like but hasn't quite decided what it's for yet." I wrote that down. I don't know what it means. I'm including it because he said it and because I believe he was trying to be accurate. I asked if he had any idea what it was. What the phenomenon was. He said no. He said in 23 years he had never developed a theory that satisfied him, and he had stopped trying because the theories didn't change the instruction and the instruction was the only thing that had ever seemed to do anything useful. I asked what he meant by useful. He said, "Every time I can document that the instruction was followed, nobody was lost." I said, "Except for Pete." He said, "Yes." I said, "Pete knew the instruction." He said, "I know." I asked if there was anything else he could tell me. Anything that might explain why the instruction sometimes wasn't enough. He said he didn't know. He said he had thought about it a long time ago and had come to the conclusion that thinking about it wasn't going to produce an answer, and that the honest thing to say was that some things don't have answers you can find from the outside of them. I thanked him. He said again that he was sorry about my crew member. I believed him. I still do. The second log I found was older, from a 1971 maintenance record from a crew operating out of Miami on what were then called the Coastal Environmental Monitoring Stations, the predecessor program to the buoy network. The log was fragmentary. The scanning had cut off partway through several pages. What survived was a handwritten service record for a station at coordinates that placed it roughly 80 miles offshore in the Florida Straits, in the Gulf Stream. The notation about the voices was not in the service section. It was on the last surviving page, which appeared to be a kind of summary entry, the crew lead writing up observations at the end of a deployment rather than in real time. He had written, the name callers were active at stations 4 and 7 again. All crew maintained protocol. Water at both stations has been anomalously warm since at least the last 3 deployments. I have flagged this in the thermal observation record. I don't know if the warmth and the calling are related, and I don't have the background to say. I pass along the instruction as I received it: do not answer. I have been following this instruction for 9 years, and so far it has kept everyone aboard. I do not know what it keeps them from. I have concluded that not knowing is the correct condition for this particular piece of knowledge, and I have tried to make peace with that. His name was on the entry. I looked it up. He had retired in 1978. He had died in 2003. His personnel file, which I was able to request through the NOAA Legacy Records system, listed his length of service, his commendations, and his cause of death as natural causes at age 78. There was no mention of any incident during his service. There was no mention of the name callers. There was a notation in the file, in a different hand from the rest of the documentation, that said, "Past standing instruction to successor per program custom." That notation had no date. It had no author. I checked the file metadata when it was scanned. The metadata showed the file had been digitized in 2011. It did not show when the notation had been added to the original paper document. I have tried to trace the standing instruction further back than 1971, and I have not been able to. The 1971 crew lead's language, as I received it, program custom, suggests it predated him by at least some years. How many years, I cannot say. The early NOAA buoy programs began in the late 1960s. The predecessor observation programs used fixed lighthouse ships and weather vessels. I do not know whether the instruction traveled with the stations themselves or with the people who worked them, or with some combination of both. I do not know its origin. I have accepted that I am not going to find its origin, and I have tried to make peace with that, the way the 1971 crew lead said he did. I have not entirely succeeded. I returned to active deployment 8 months after Pete was lost. Marcus had transferred to the Wrightsville Beach operation, not a demotion, a lateral move, but one that put him on a different route and a different vessel. I don't know if that was his choice or if it was facilitated by management who thought a change of route would help. I didn't ask. Danny took a leave of absence that extended into a resignation. I heard she was working on a marine construction crew out of Wilmington. She sends a Christmas card every year. We do not discuss what happened. The Moorhead City crew rebuilt around a new crew lead named Yolanda Ferris, who came from the Beaufort Small Boat Station and who had 6 years of buoy maintenance experience on the Florida East Coast route. She was competent and exacting and had a management style that ran toward documentation and procedure, which I respected. When I came back aboard, I told her I wanted to brief her on some standing operational considerations for the route. She said that sounded fine, and we sat down over coffee one morning before a scheduled deployment. I told her about the voices. I told her everything I have written here, the sequence of events, what each crew member heard, the instruction Marcus had given, the chain of transmission I had traced back to 1971 and possibly before. I told her about the thermal anomalies at the stations where the voices had been active. I told her about the Gulf of Mexico 1986 fatality and the Gloucester 1994 log entry. I told her about the conversation with the retired crew lead in Massachusetts. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Is there anything in writing I can give to new crew members?" I said no. I told her why. The instruction had never been in the written guidance, and putting it there created problems I had thought about and had no clean answer for. She said, "So I'm supposed to pass this on the same way you received it?" I said yes. She looked at her coffee. Then she said, "And you believe it?" I said, "I believe Pete knew the instruction and followed it on deck and went into the water anyway and didn't come back, and I don't know what happened between those two facts, and I have to live with not knowing." She said, "That's not quite what I asked." I said, "I know." "Yes. I believe it." She said she would pass it on. I want to address something before I close this account, because I have been writing carefully and I want to continue being careful. The standing instruction, "Do not answer the voices," exists as an operational directive in a very specific sense. It is believed, by the people who have carried it, to have a protective function. The retired crew lead in Massachusetts articulated this clearly: "Every time I can document that the instruction was followed, nobody was lost." That is a claim about correlation. It is not a claim about mechanism. I want to be careful not to transform a claim about correlation into a claim about mechanism, because I do not know the mechanism. I do not think anyone who has carried this instruction has known the mechanism. What I know is that the instruction exists, that it has been transmitted continuously through a chain of individual crew leads for at least 50 years and possibly longer, and that it is not written down anywhere in the official operational guidance of any program I have been able to examine. It exists entirely in the spoken space between people who have worked these stations and have encountered what the 1971 crew lead called the name callers. I also know that Pete is gone, and that Pete knew the instruction, and that the instruction did not protect him. I have thought about whether this means the instruction was wrong, or incomplete, or that it was followed incorrectly in some way I cannot identify. I have not come to a resolution. The retirement-era crew lead said some things don't have answers you can find from the outside of them. I think he was right, and I think he was also telling me something about the instruction itself, that the instruction is a thing you carry from the outside, a behavioral rule whose protective mechanism you cannot see from where you stand, and that carrying it correctly may require accepting that you will never see the mechanism and that this is simply the condition of the work. I don't know if Pete answered the voice in the water. I don't know what it sounds like from inside the water, if it even sounds the same from in there. I don't know if the tether came unclipped before or after whatever happened to him. I don't know if he made a decision or if a decision was made around him, or if the distinction between those two things holds up at 67 miles offshore in anomalously warm water with something in the dark below him that knew his full name, including the part he didn't like. I have been carrying all of that for going on 2 years now. I carry it on every deployment. I carry it when we pull alongside a buoy, and Pete's absence is present in every task allocation, every line assignment, Every water entry we make with 2 crew members maintaining visual contact per the revised protocol that was implemented because he was lost. The protocol change is sensible. It closes a real gap. It does not address the name callers. The name callers are still out there. I know this because I have heard them twice more since returning to active deployment, once at 7 Foxtrot during a spring service run, once at a station I will not identify because I don't want to create the impression that the phenomenon is station-specific. I did not answer. I logged an anomalous acoustic observation in the maintenance record both times. I did not specify what I heard. I have not found a form that holds that specification. Yolanda passed the standing instruction to 2 new crew members in the past year. Both of them took it the way most people take a piece of institutional lore they can't verify, with a kind of provisional acceptance that files it somewhere accessible without fully committing to it. I understand that response. I had it myself before October. I have told them, do not answer it. Do not answer it from the deck, do not answer it from the water, do not let the fact that it knows your name be the thing that decides your response. I have told them the instruction is real and that following it matters and that I cannot tell them why it matters in any terms I can prove, which I know is a deeply unsatisfying thing to be told about a rule you are expected to follow in the middle of open water at 67 miles offshore. I have told them what I can. I have been as accurate as I know how to be. The 2023 maintenance log for the Moorhead City Corridor shows full completion of all scheduled service operations without incident. The NDBC system shows all stations transmitting within nominal parameters. Battery voltages are current. Sensor calibration records are up to date. The buoys are doing what buoys do, sitting on the surface of the ocean, measuring the world, reporting back. Pete's personnel file in the NOAA HR system was closed in the standard manner following confirmation of death in absentia. His emergency contact, his wife, Meredith, whose phone call I described at the beginning of this account, was notified through the proper channels. His service record lists his length of employment, his certifications, and the date and manner of his death. The manner of death is listed as accidental drowning. The standing operational instruction that has been transmitted verbally through the buoy maintenance program for at least 53 years is not in his file. It is not in anyone's file. It exists where it has always existed, in the spoken space, in the gap between what the forms can hold and what the work actually is. 7 Hotel is currently scheduled for its next routine service in 3 weeks. The water temperature data from the station's own sensors has been reading 2.1 degrees above seasonal baseline for the past 6 days. The anomaly is within the range the system flags as requiring notation but not investigation. The notation will go into the environmental record. Nothing will be dispatched to investigate it. The station will wait for its service date. I will be on the crew. I will bring the instruction with me, the way I bring it now wherever I go on the water. I will pass it to anyone I work with who hasn't heard it yet, and I will say it the way Marcus said it, level, specific, non-negotiable. I will say, if you hear a voice that knows your name, do not answer it. I will not be able to explain why. I have accepted that. I have accepted it in the same way the 1971 crew lead said he accepted it, which means I have accepted it imperfectly and incompletely and with a kind of grief underneath the acceptance that does not seem to be going anywhere. The water does not owe me an explanation. It has never owed anyone an explanation. It was here before any of us and it will be here after, and what lives in it, what moves through the warm anomalies and knows names and calls out from the unoccupied side of vessels at the limit of our range, has no obligation to make itself comprehensible to the people who service the instruments that measure it. I just wish it didn't know Pete's name. I wish it hadn't known it so precisely. I wish it hadn't known the part he never used, the part that was only on paper, the part that was his and not in circulation. I don't know what that specificity means. I don't know if it means the thing that called him had been watching him for a while, accumulating him, or if it means something else entirely. I don't know if the specificity was a sign of something or just the way the thing operates regardless of sign. I have stopped looking for the explanation. Not because I've found peace with not having it, but because looking uses up the attention I need for the work, and the work is what I have left to give that is worth giving. The buoys need to be serviced. The data needs to be accurate. The water temperature at 7 Hotel reads 2.1 degrees above baseline and the station is waiting. In 3 weeks I will be there. I will not answer.